Друзі, вітаємо всіх, хто
Friends, we welcome everyone who joined us in the press hall and online. The next briefing is devoted to the new report that the mission of UN on Human Rights is presenting. We welcome Ms. Bogner, the head of the mission in Ukraine.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, I would like to welcome those present here today and those joining us online. Today, we are launching our 31st periodic report, which covers the period from the 1st of August 2020 to the 31st of January 2021. The findings we present are based on information gathered during 91 field visits, 7 visits to places of detention, 56 trial hearings, 37 assemblies, and 1,108 interviews with victims and witnesses and other sources of information. Since the agreement on measures to strengthen the ceasefire took effect on the 27th of July 2020, OHCHR has noted a significant improvement in the security situation compared to the preceding reporting period. 3 civilians were injured by active hostilities this reporting period, while none were killed. However, OHCHR is concerned by the continuously high number of civilian casualties, including children, but caused by mines and explosive remnants of war, which killed 8 people and injured 28 others over the reporting period. 2 other civilians, including a girl, were injured by a road accident with a military vehicle. OHCHR recorded 4 attacks affecting civilian objects, none of which resulted in damage. To compare, there were 72 such incidents in the preceding 6 months. Attacks put the lives of workers in water and sanitation facilities at risk and threatened the civilian population's water supply. We urge parties to the conflict to fully respect the ceasefire and comply with international humanitarian law. We also underline the need to strengthen mine awareness measures, including for children and young people. COVID-19 restrictions continue to put a heavy burden on civilians who need to cross the contact line, restricting their freedom of movement. As a result, from the 1st of August 2020 to the 31st of January 2021, the number of crossings of the contact line in both directions decreased by 96% compared with the same period 1 year earlier. Older persons, and particularly older women, who comprise the majority of those crossing before the COVID-19 lockdowns, have been particularly affected. While the crossing point in the Lugansk region at Stanitsa Luganska is operational on a daily basis, in the Donetsk region, civilians are only able to cross at Novotroitska twice a week, and only with permission from armed groups, usually having to sign a statement that they will not return until the pandemic restrictions are lifted. As a result, many people opt to cross to government-controlled territory through the Russian Federation, exposing themselves to additional health risks, hardship, and financial expenditure, as well as administrative liability, including fines from the Ukrainian government. Severe restrictions on freedom of movement across the contact line have particularly impacted pensioners residing in territory controlled by self-proclaimed republics, who face problems accessing their pensions in government-controlled territory. Families are also struggling to register their children's births. UNHCR estimates that up to 65,000 children did not have Ukrainian state-issued birth certificates. This makes it difficult for those living on territory controlled by self-proclaimed republics to exercise their rights as Ukrainian citizens. We once again urge the state to establish an administrative procedure for registration of birth for those in armed group-controlled territory. OHCHR regrets that there is still no comprehensive state policy for remedy and reparation to civilian victims of the conflict, almost 7 years since the armed conflict in eastern Ukraine began. While some steps are being taken in this direction, such as the drafting of a concept of state policy on transitional justice and budget allocations for compensation for those whose housing in government-controlled territory was destroyed by hostilities, it is time for an effective system to be finally put in place. The report sets out further details on how this could be done. During the reporting period, OHCHR continued to enjoy unimpeded access to official places of detention in government-controlled territory, allowing for confidential interviews with detainees while respecting COVID-19 prevention measures. OHCHR is concerned that the SBU has continued the practice of detaining people believed to be linked or affiliated with self-proclaimed republics in unofficial places of detention in violation of Ukraine's international obligations. Additionally, law enforcement agencies continued to arrest individuals believed to be linked or affiliated with self-proclaimed republics without court-issued warrants, contrary to the Criminal Procedure Code. While the number of cases of conflict-related torture and ill-treatment has decreased in recent years, OHCHR remains concerned about a persistent pattern of torture and ill-treatment by law enforcement officials in cases that are not related to the conflict, in particular through police violence. In territory controlled by self-proclaimed republics, OHCHR continued to be denied access to detainees and places of deprivation of liberty. This is particularly concerning given the widespread and credible allegations of torture and ill-treatment in a number of facilities, as well as of detention conditions that do not meet international human rights standards. OHCHR continues to document cases of conflict-related, arbitrary and incommunicado detention in this territory. In most cases carried out by the so-called Ministries of State Security, those apprehended are at risk of ill-treatment as well as other violations of their rights. Turning now to the administration of justice in government-controlled territory. Legislation needs to be brought in line with international human rights law, including through amendments to the Criminal Code to allow for the full retrial of all cases that have been tried in absentia. OHCHR welcomes the decision of the Constitutional Court to annul criminal liability of judges for delivering deliberately unjust decisions, which came into force on the 11th of December. At the same time, OHCHR strongly recommends to Parliament to refrain from reintroducing this provision into the Criminal Code, which would jeopardise the independence of judges. The Parliament currently has before it 3 draft laws on the topic. Restrictions related to the COVID-19 pandemic have further compounded delays, leading to unjustifiably prolonged trials. Judges and court staff also complained to OHCHR about the lack of funding provided by courts to prevent the spread of COVID-19, which jeopardises their safety. OHCHR is following developments with the Constitutional Court. We underline that it is important to resolve the crisis in full compliance with international standards on the independence and accountability of judges. More than 7 years since the tragic events during the Maidan protests, we continue to monitor proceedings in relation to the 2014 killings and violent deaths during these protests, as well as those in Odessa. While incremental progress is being made, justice is still lacking for victims. Over the reporting period, OHCHR documented 18 cases of threats and attacks against journalists and other media workers, human rights defenders, civil and political activists, LGBTI people and their supporters, and members of national minorities. Of the 18 incidents documented by OHCHR, 4 consisted of attacks, reprisals, and harassment of human rights defenders due to their public activities. One incident occurred in territory controlled by the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic, where those investigating apprehended an LGBTI activist and questioned him regarding his activities without granting him access to a defense lawyer. OHCHR also remains concerned that armed groups arbitrarily detained individuals for their social media posts. In one case, a blogger was reportedly detained for his articles on arbitrary detention and torture by members of armed groups in territory controlled by self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic, which they described as extremist. Several religious communities in territory controlled by self-proclaimed republics continued to face limitations on the enjoyment of their freedom of religion and belief. In the lead up to local elections in October 2020, OHCHR observed a wave of attacks against members and staff of political parties, mainly targeting two opposition parties considered by many to be pro-Russian. OHCHR is also concerned to note that government regulations limiting mass gatherings during the COVID-19 lockdown were selectively applied to peaceful assemblies. Law enforcement agencies often failed to effectively protect victims, prevent violence, and hold perpetrators, including members of groups that promote violence, such as extreme right-wing groups, to account. OHCHR continued to document incidents of hate speech and threats against national minorities, including Roma, and those speaking Russian and Hungarian, as well as foreign students, and recorded a new wave of hatred and threats against critics of the law on the state language. Amongst national minorities, Roma people continued to be the most targeted by hate speech online and offline, including incitement to violence. OHCHR is concerned that the police continues to investigate such cases as less serious crimes, failing to take into account the motives of attacks based on a victim's identity. Authorities must speak up to condemn attacks, threats, intimidation, and hate speech, and systematically support law enforcement agencies to ensure prompt, impartial, and effective investigations into such incidents. On 2 February, the President of Ukraine signed a decision of the National Council for Security and Defense, resulting in the immediate repeal of the broadcasting licenses of 3 television channels who were forced to cease their broadcast. While it is a legitimate aim for states to protect their national security, including by countering disinformation, OHCHR is concerned that this decision will impact on freedom of expression in Ukraine and recalls that states are under the obligation to respect, protect, and ensure the right to freedom of expression, including the right to seek, receive, and impart diverse information and ideas. Regarding the language rights of minorities, OHCHR notes the establishment by the Parliamentary Committee on Human Rights of a working group charged with drafting a law on the protection of national minorities. More than a year has passed since the deadline for the establishment of this law. OHCHR urges that the law be elaborated without delay and in a consultative and inclusive manner, ensuring the participation of all linguistic minorities. OHCHR also notes with concern that since 16 January 2021, hate-motivated attacks and threats increased towards individuals who openly criticised the law on state language and expressed positive views about the Russian language. The authorities should publicly condemn these incidents and initiate investigations when required. The last year of the COVID-19 crisis has shown that governments across the world need to work more effectively to protect groups in vulnerable situations. The pandemic in Ukraine has revealed vulnerabilities among unpaid healthcare workers, 83% of whom are women, among homeless people without sufficient shelter services who now in the winter face the risks of cold-related injuries and hypothermia, and people with disabilities. OHCHR has been looking particularly at the situation of the 40,000 persons with intellectual and psychosocial disabilities who continue to be deprived of their legal capacity in Ukraine, denying them the enjoyment of their basic rights, including the rights to vote, to choose their place of residence, to dispose of property, to marry, and to work. While persons deprived of legal capacity can apply to court for the restoration of their legal capacity, OHCHR's monitoring shows that very few people have actually been able to do so. They lacked accessible information about legal aid, and there has been limited competence of some judges to deal with such cases. OHCHR is also concerned that the lack of community-based services and accessible and affordable housing prevent persons with intellectual and psychosocial disabilities from living independently in their community. Efforts must be made towards deinstitutionalization, increasing access of persons with intellectual and psychosocial disabilities to social housing, supported residential facilities, and other support services. In the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, Ukraine, we continued to document violations of international human rights and international humanitarian law, and to make recommendations to remedy these to the Russian Federation as an occupying power. The Orthodox Church of Ukraine has come under increasing pressure, including the potential loss of its two largest places of worship in Crimea. Individuals of other faiths have also come under pressure, with individual Jehovah's Witnesses facing extremism-related criminal charges and prosecution for practicing their faith. Law enforcement authorities in Crimea also conducted at least 19 searches in dwellings belonging to Jehovah's Witnesses in 2020. Deportations and forcible transfers also continued. In 2020, courts in Crimea issued deportation and forcible transfer orders against at least 178 individuals considered foreigners under Russian Federation immigration law, including 105 Ukrainian citizens. OHCHR recalls that international humanitarian law prohibits individual and mass forcible transfers, as well as deportations of protected persons from occupied territory to the territory of the occupying power or to that of any other country, regardless of the motive. OHCHR is also concerned about continued reports of inadequate conditions of detention in penitentiary institutions in Crimea, as well as the Russian Federation, where current and former detainees from Crimea have been deported to serve their sentences. This includes poor hygiene conditions and denial of access to medical care, inadequate heating, lack of ventilation, and inadequate nutrition. We also express concern at continued reports of incommunicado detention being imposed on Crimean detainees serving sentences in the Russian Federation. Incommunicado detention deprives inmates of any contact with the outside world and has repeatedly been recognized as a form of torture. Looking forward, we will be issuing an update on the human rights situation in Ukraine in early June, and the next full report in September. Since the establishment of the Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, OHCHR has issued 31 regular reports and 8 thematic reports. These contain concrete, practical, and fact-based recommendations for improvement of the human rights situation in Ukraine. Following on from our initial assessment in September last year, we have further assessed that the government of Ukraine has fully implemented 12% of accessible recommendations made by OHCHR in its previous periodic and thematic reports on Ukraine, and partially implemented 57% of these, leaving 31% unimplemented. This is encouraging progress. Meanwhile, self-proclaimed republics have fully implemented 3% of recommendations and partially implemented 19%, leaving 78% unimplemented. The Russian Federation, as the occupying power in Crimea, has not fully implemented any of the assessed recommendations and partly implemented 3% of these recommendations, leaving 97% of recommendations unimplemented. We call on all duty bearers to implement the recommendations made by the Human Rights Monitoring Mission and stand ready to assist them in these efforts. Thank you.
Друзі, якщо маєте запитання до спікерів,
Dear friends, if you have any questions to the speaker, please raise your hand and introduce yourself, please. Nagia Yurchenko, Ukrinform. Do your monitors know about the concentration camp in Donetsk Oblast? If you know about that, have you put it into your recent report? Because this concentration camp has been existing for long. If not, are you going to meet the author of a book, Stanislav Moiseev, tomorrow, who was there for 2 years and who told everyone about those tortures, and those are actual medieval tortures?
Thank you for the question. I believe you're talking about the Alexia place of detention it's called Alexia informally in Donetsk. Certainly we follow that. We have documented and we have published information about that. In particular, we published last year quite a detailed annex to one of our reports that went through many allegations of torture and ill treatment in that facility. That is one of the facilities that we are highly concerned about because of the torture and ill treatment that goes on there. We have not included much information on that in this current report. However, we are currently preparing a report to be released in June that will have a lot of information on that. That will be particularly highlighted, the conditions in Alexia detention facility.
друзі, ще запитання?
Any more questions, please? Yes, we have a question. Good morning. You are first channel. According to monitoring of your organization, do you know how many people on the occupied and government-controlled territory that have no access to pension? Do you know any percentage or the number of people who don't have access to pensions?
Thank you for the question. I don't think there are well-documented figures. Some people have come up with particular estimates. I don't have those at my fingertips right now, but we're certainly aware that there are many people who have not been able to access their pension due to the closure and restrictions of the contact line. This is something that we're highly concerned about and that we advocate on consistently. We advocate on all of those who have control of territory around the contact line and who control the crossing points to ease those restrictions. Of course, with COVID-19, it is legitimate to put certain restrictions in place to ensure the health and safety of people. But we believe that people can cross safely and that measures can be put in place to allow more people to cross and to allow them to access their pensions. Pension is something that is needed by people. It is something that allows them to have an adequate standard of living, and without that, people are dropping into poverty and are suffering. So this is something that really does need to be addressed.
Друзі, ще запитання?
Any more questions? If there are no more questions, okay, let's put it to an end. If you want, our speaker can give comments to your cameras.